Bandits broke into the home of a female surgeon in the middle of the night. If only they knew who she was sheltering. Gina Hunt's medical career was going quite well. After graduating from university, she got a job as a surgeon in a district hospital. "You have golden hands," said her colleagues. "In the capital, you could earn a lot of money in a private clinic, but here in this provincial town, there's no future." Well, Gina laughed in response. "People live here too, and they need treatment. You can't earn all the money in the world. And as for prospects, you never know where you'll find them or lose them." By choosing the noble profession of a doctor, Gina followed in her grandmother's footsteps. Her grandmother was a cardiologist who had saved many seemingly hopeless patients. Michelle Benson was no longer alive, but in the district hospital where her granddaughter now worked, she was still remembered and spoken of fondly. Gina's father was a geologist, Edward Hunt, who died 7 years ago. Gina's mother, Jeanette Hunt, was a primary school teacher. After her husband's death, she never remarried, despite having plenty of opportunities. "I guess I'm a one-man woman," Jeanette would say. Gina both envied and pitied her mother. How wonderful it must be to meet someone you love once and for all. But her mom was still young and an attractive woman, and Gina wanted to see her happy. Gina lived in the suburbs, in a village. And every day, except, of course, on weekends, she commuted to work. Gina laughed when she recalled how she came to apply for the job at the hospital. When she said she lived in the village, the chief doctor asked in bewilderment how Gina would get to work. Apparently, Richard Cooper, Gina thought with a smirk, looking at his badge, doesn't know about scheduled buses. He probably thinks we villagers only know how to ride horses. Anyone who lives in a village and has tried to get a job in the city can confirm, city employers aren't too keen on hiring rural residents. As ridiculous as it sounds, some of them really believe that villagers use anything but private or public transport. And who knows what fate would have awaited Gina if it weren't for the head of the cardiology department. "Hello, Gina," Shirley Curtis smiled. "Are you here for a job too?" "Do you know each other?" the potential boss asked in surprise. "Well, Richard, I've known Gina since she was a schoolgirl," his colleague smiled. "She's Michelle Benson's granddaughter." "Really? Really," the woman laughed. "Well, if Gina becomes as great a doctor as her grandmother," the chief doctor chuckled, "then I'm willing to take the risk." "Do you promise?" Gina promised. That's how she got a job at the district hospital. Initially, Gina was seen as Michelle's granddaughter, but over time, she was noticed and stood out among her colleagues. Gina was always diligent and responsible. Despite having to commute from the village, while some colleagues who lived on the next street could be late. Some of them shook their heads in horror, imagining how Gina got up early in the morning, got on a bus, and went to work. And after a hard day's work, she had to go back the same way. It was 20 whole kilometers. Such dedication was admirable. "Half of our village commutes to the city for work," she replied with a smile. "That certainly doesn't scare us. And we don't have a choice, we need the job." "What kind of dedication is that?" At first, it was hard, but then Gina got used to it. After her workday, she would stop by the store, buy groceries, and get on the bus. Such was her simple evening routine. Jeanette, who got an apartment in the city as a teacher, often offered her daughter to move in with her, but Gina genuinely loved the village, the fresh air, and working in the garden. Besides, the trips back and forth didn't seem so burdensome to her. What were 20 kilometers on a comfortable bus? On one of these trips, Gina met a young disabled man in a wheelchair who was begging at the bus station. She saw him every day and even knew that his name was Dan. He was quite handsome, and Gina sometimes wondered what had driven him to this. Though it was obvious despair. Gina noticed that people willingly gave alms to Dan. One day, she saw 2 men approach him. These 2 also appeared at the bus station from time to time, begging for money. One was in a military uniform with a cane, the other was grimy and in rags that barely resembled clothes. This creature had a child in its arms, wrapped in a tattered checkered blanket. Gina often wondered, where was this baby's mother? And she was also concerned about why the baby was always silent. Was the man adding alcohol to the bottle? "Hey, we need to talk," the man with the cane said to Dan. "I'm listening," he nodded cautiously. "Not here." Dan shrugged, and they headed towards the garages across the road from the bus station. Gina herself didn't understand what made her follow them, but something told her she had to. From the expressions on their faces, Gina realized that the men hadn't approached Dan with good intentions. She followed the voices and, hiding behind one of the garages, listened to the conversation. Gina could practically feel that the conversation didn't bode well for Dan. "So, why the hell are you stealing our client?" the guy in the military uniform asked menacingly. "Why should I?" Dan smirked crookedly. "Because you're hanging around the bus station from morning till night," the grimy one interrupted. "You collect a couple of thousand, then go home in your chariot and let others earn something." "Why are you even talking to him?" the soldier exclaimed and struck Dan with his cane. The blow landed on his shoulder. Gina decisively jumped out of her hiding place, rushed at him, and shouted, "Stop it right now!" The soldier was taken aback, but quickly assessed the situation and turned his attention to Gina. However, she was quicker. She snatched the cane from the attacker and pointed it at him. The filthy man put down his bundle and hurried to help his companion. Gina fended off the beggars with the cane, but they didn't give up. Suddenly, the soldier accidentally stepped on the bundle, which immediately responded in a doll-like voice. "Mama, pick me up!" "Idiot!" yelled the ragged man. "Watch where you're going." Gina looked at the bundle in confusion. The blanket unfolded, revealing a cute, rosy-cheeked, toy baby doll. She had been wondering why the baby was so quiet. "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you," the lone father hissed threateningly at Gina. And grabbing the doll, he hurried after his companion, who was already pulling him by the arm. "Are you okay?" Gina asked Dan, who was obviously feeling awkward. He nodded, though he winced in pain, holding his shoulder. "Shall we go to the station then?" The guy nodded again. "Do you often have such conflicts?" Gina asked. "Not really," he shrugged. Looking at the timetable, Gina noted 15 minutes left until the bus. Suddenly, she realized she didn't want to part with Dan. Who knows, maybe Gina could help him somehow. If, of course, he would accept the help. He seemed too proud and independent. "Dan, do you have any relatives?" she asked. "Just in case?" The guy shook his head. "I grew up in an orphanage," he replied. "Why do you ask?" "Well, is there really no one who can help a young guy like you?" Dan frowned. He had recently been discharged from the hospital, and the words of the trauma surgeon were still fresh in his mind. "I'm very sorry, but you won't be able to walk. However, if you decide to fight for your health, you should go to the capital. Or better yet, to Germany or Israel, where they perform such operations. But we, unfortunately, are not miracle workers. Although your nerve endings are functioning, we still won't be able to help you. We are just a district hospital." The words sounded like mockery. How could an orphan student afford an operation in Germany, Israel, or even at home? Still, was it worth being angry at the doctor? He was just outlining the situation. So Dan had no choice but to thank the doctor. "Sorry, did I say something wrong?" Gina asked, noticing Dan's depressed expression. "It's fine," he waved his hand. "Are you sure?" "Yes, of course." The boarding announcement for the village bus was made. "I have to go," Gina said awkwardly. "We'll see each other again." She got on the bus. Looking out the window, Gina saw Dan on the platform. He was smiling reservedly. And when the bus started moving, he seemed to wave to her shyly. The bus disappeared from sight. Dan wheeled himself home, reflecting on his life along the way. He had once been a driven, hard-working guy. After leaving the orphanage, Dan studied part-time at an architectural and construction college and worked on a construction site. He was popular with girls, enjoyed sports, loved fishing and hiking. Dan had grand plans for his life, but a workplace accident ruined them. He severely injured his back, resulting in paralysis. He was given a small compensation, but it was only enough for meager sustenance and cheap painkillers. For a young and healthy guy, this was a real tragedy. An orphan and now disabled, that's who he was. The prospects were bleak, pure hopelessness. Was this the end? Discharged from the hospital in a wheelchair, Dan fell into despair. He returned to the apartment that was allocated to him as a former orphan and suddenly realized that it felt foreign. Everything was foreign. After thinking it over, Dan understood that it wasn't surprising. He had left the apartment healthy, energetic, and full of optimism, but returned as a cripple. There was his bed. Dan ran his hand over his favorite checkered blanket and then pulled it away. The bed felt horrifically cold. And there was the photo album. He knew he would never look through those photos again. In them, he was healthy and cheerful, and most importantly, he could walk. Not only walk, but dance heartily at parties and nightclubs. And this was his favorite chair, but now he had no need for it. Sometimes Dan was visited by friends from the orphanage and classmates from college. They all tried to cheer him up as best they could, but they understood it was futile. Some advice on how to move forward was given, but unfortunately, all of it was useless. A former classmate, Louis Butler, suggested Dan study online and then find a remote job. Why not? He thought with enthusiasm. Maybe I'll become a programmer or learn another modern profession. So, Dan followed his friend's advice, but it turned out to be much more difficult than he had imagined. The good courses, where one could actually learn something, cost a lot of money, which Dan simply didn't have. Then he decided to go a different route, to find a remote job without any courses, as he had come across many such advertisements. He reasonably thought that among the variety of offers, he could find a suitable option. But there were indeed many vacancies, but they were mostly network marketing, financial pyramids, or just unclear propositions. Is this so-called online earning even real? Dan wondered. Or are those who claim to make good money from it just blatant liars? One day, he found an ad. A construction company was looking for a dispatcher to work from home. Dan decided this was his chance. He had a laptop and a phone, thank God. Plus, he had studied at an architectural and construction college. So, it wasn't the worst option for a construction company. Dan signed up for an interview, and he was in for another pleasant surprise. It turned out the company's office was very close to where he lived. You should have seen the way the HR manager looked at him. It was a sticky, viscous mixture of pity, condescension, and disgust. You know that dispatchers work around the clock, right? Drivers are on the line 24 hours a day, and breakdowns or other unpleasant things can happen at any time. What's the problem? Dan frowned in confusion. As you can understand, I'm almost always at home, and such a job is one of the few suitable options for me. What if something happens to you? Everything that could happen to me has already happened, Dan smiled grimly. And I need a job. Is it too much to ask? No, but... You, the girl hesitantly nodded towards Dan's wheelchair, and he continued. Disabled, you mean? Notice, you said that. The girl made a strict face. All the best, he said, turning and heading towards the door. Dan rolled down the corridor, and everyone turned to look at him. Friends from the orphanage advised him not to give up, but it was easy for those who could walk, run, and jump to say that. Nevertheless, hope still flickered in his soul. Indeed, just because he was essentially turned down by one organization, it didn't mean the same would happen in another. But Dan visited for more offices with the same result. However, a former classmate, Kathy Williams, whose fiancé worked as a hiring manager, explained that it wasn't necessarily about his disability. After all, there were many applicants, but only one position. This was encouraging, but Dan still didn't find a job. Old friends began to remind him of themselves less and less, and Dan began to lose heart. And he did fall into despair. Returning from another unsuccessful interview, Dan suddenly felt an acute desire to drink. Hoping to find some money, he searched all his pockets and desk drawers. In the end, Dan scraped together enough money not only to get drunk but also to survive for a week. But what will happen after that, he thought with a sigh. This thought made him feel even worse, and he went to the store. Trying to ignore the sympathetic looks from the saleswoman and acquaintances, Dan bought a bottle of alcohol and a meager snack. In the morning, he stepped out onto the balcony and took a deep breath of his hometown scents. The fresh air made him dizzy, and Dan winced. "What's the matter, headache?" asked a neighbor with a smirk, who lived in the adjacent apartment in the neighboring entrance. It seemed his name was Alvin. "A bit," Dan nodded. "Well, you should fix that. Maybe we should team up?" They teamed up for a bottle, then another. And when a third one appeared, some shady-looking characters suddenly showed up in the apartment. But Dan didn't care. It was easy and fun in the company of his new friends. They were the ones who suggested Dan go into begging. It turned out Ted and Douglas had a friend under whom the beggars worked. Some indeed had problems in life and physical disabilities, others were perfectly healthy but just didn't like to work. This friend, whose name no one knew, bought Dan's laptop for next to nothing. Dan didn't care. What did he need it for? The gadget reminded him of unfulfilled hopes to start a new life, even as a person with disabilities. During the day, Dan was begging at the bus station, and in the evening, his apartment was filled with smoke. After a hard day, he bought alcohol, and Alvin, Ted, and Douglas also came not empty-handed. "Dan, have you ever thought about swapping your apartment?" Douglas asked one day. "I haven't thought about it," he replied. "Well, think about it. Why do you need such a big place all to yourself? As if it's so grand." Dan laughed. "Well, some families are cramped in one-bedroom apartments," Ted noted. Dan sighed bitterly. A family, he'd probably never have one. Who would want a disabled beggar? And true enough, why did he need a two-bedroom apartment now? He had to admit, it was quite spacious. "Think about it," Douglas continued. "I can even give you the contact details of some knowledgeable people. If you handle it right, you could end up with a cozy one-bedroom in a good neighborhood and a decent amount of cash. Interested?" Dan wondered, don't these two have too many knowledgeable people? They seem to have everything figured out everywhere. Then again, what's so surprising about that? They just know how to navigate and make useful connections. Maybe, Dan nodded. "I'll think about it." The next couple of days, his friends didn't show up, and he forgot about the tempting offer. On the third day, Dan met Gina. Yeah, no doubt about it, a pretty girl, he thought, looking at the slender girl with a kind smile. Her eyes reminded Dan of two lakes, clear and serene. And her lips? Full, sensual, and without a hint of silicone, unlike the glamorous dolls he'd seen near boutiques and beauty salons he happened to pass by. Dan didn't know much about that, but he'd learned to distinguish natural lips from injected ones. Dan was far from being a chaste guy. When he was in college, he had plenty of acquaintances. After all, he was a handsome young man leading an active lifestyle. All the girls Dan had been with were the same, uninhibited, regulars at loud parties and wild get-togethers. They loved to drink and smoke. It was fun with them, but only that. Gina was entirely different. A girl like Gina made you want to protect her and carry her gently through life. But Dan, unfortunately, wasn't capable of that. On the day he met Gina, for the first time in several days, he didn't feel like getting drunk. And if he was going to think about her, he didn't want his mind clouded by alcohol. Alvin called. "Dan, how about we have a drink?" the neighbor suggested. "No, not today. I'm not feeling well." "Well, suit yourself." Dan felt relieved that Alvin didn't insist. When Gina got home, her mother, Jeanette, called her. "Dear, we need to have a serious talk." It turned out her mother had met a man, and she didn't know how to tell her daughter about it. Silly mom. It's like Gina is the mother and not the other way around. What kind of man? Come on, Mom, tell me all about him, she encouraged. And Jeanette, reassured by her daughter's words, told her everything. It turned out that 2 weeks ago, a high school admirer, Dennis Cole, found her on social media. They messaged each other, shared their life stories, and decided to meet. And they did, and then again. He's also a widower and wants to live with me, Jeanette told her daughter. But I don't even know what to say. Oh, Mom. Gina laughed. Here's what I think, listen to your heart. But my heart is silent, her mother sighed. It will never be like it was with Dad, but you still want some happiness, right? Gina noted. So, why refuse it? And I really want to meet him. Really? She didn't mention meeting Dan. After all, what was there to tell? She saved a disabled guy from some competitors, and that's it. They barely talked. But why couldn't Gina get him out of her head? He was a handsome guy, that's for sure. Before the disability and begging, he probably was popular with the opposite sex. And why not? He likely had some education. Unlike the faces of the so-called warrior with a crutch and the dirty man with a doll, which were not burdened with intellect, Dan's was quite the opposite. He had the look of an intelligent and thoughtful person. Working in the hospital, Gina had seen many formerly active, energetic, and successful people broken by life's hardships. Most of them were men. And it's not surprising. Women usually have more incentive to fight for survival, often their children. Gina decided she would definitely get to know this guy better and see where it led. The next day, when Gina arrived at the station loaded with grocery bags, Dan raised his hand in greeting and smiled. She nodded in response and entered the waiting room. Seeing a woman who lived in the same village, Gina said, "Darlene, I'll be right back. Can you watch my bags here, please?" "Of course." And Gina headed over to Dan. "Good evening. How are you?" "Everything's fine," he replied reservedly. Gina wanted to ask if the competitors were bothering him, but something told her it was better to refrain from such questions. She suggested they sit in a cafe, but Dan declined. What an idiot I am. Gina scolded herself on the bus. A complete idiot. He feels awkward being in a wheelchair, while I can walk on my own. Gina understood perfectly. Dan indeed felt embarrassed about appearing in a cafe with her, and not just because he was in a wheelchair. The workers in all the nearby shops and eateries knew exactly how Dan earned his living. And God forbid they think he was trying to hustle Gina for a nice meal or, worse, rob her. There were plenty of beggars who would do such things without a second thought, like the warrior or the single father. For them, it was as easy as saying good morning. Dan imagined how, if he weren't disabled, he would take this fair-haired nymph to a cafe or restaurant. No, it's better not to think about it. What's the use? Nevertheless, they became friends. Every time Gina came to the bus station after work, they talked a lot. Dan told Gina about how he became disabled. Each day, they realized that their views on life matched in many ways. One Friday, acting on a sudden impulse, Gina invited Dan to her place. "Why?" he asked, surprised. "Well, I just want to invite you over. Sincerely. I realized I'd enjoy having you as a guest. How does that sound?" Gina also wanted her mother, who was visiting, to meet her friend. She understood that if Dan knew he was to meet her mother, he would likely refuse. So, she chose not to mention it. On the bus, the townspeople looked at Dan curiously. They wondered what a young, beautiful, intelligent woman could have in common with a beggar from the bus station. Gina guessed what they were thinking. Who cares? She liked this person who clearly resorted to begging out of necessity. The opinion of the townspeople was of no concern to her. You can't please everyone. Besides, Jeanette liked their guest. He's a good guy, she whispered to her daughter when they went to the kitchen to put the roasted chicken on a platter and cut more bread. Very good. Gina responded warmly. He's just had bad luck. Who knows? Jeanette smiled slyly. Dan left the next day on the evening train. For him, it was more comfortable not only in terms of physical comfort. He felt too uncomfortable under the curious gazes of the town's residents. After that memorable dinner, Dan began to visit Gina regularly. While she was at work, he helped out around the house as best as he could. He dusted, cooked simple but very tasty dishes he called bachelor meals, watered the houseplants, and worked in the garden. Dan resolutely refused money for his help, but Gina would give him vegetables from the garden and some other food. In short, he had put begging behind him. Sometimes, Dan even stayed the night at her place. Gina suspected that the local gossips were starting to talk about them. But that was the least of her worries. Their relationship was platonic, and any speculation was clearly a product of idle minds. People generally prefer to believe in what stirs their imagination. One day, Dan was watering the cucumbers. This task had a calming effect on him. Even as a child, when he watered the garden with the other kids from the orphanage, he imagined he was nourishing the plants, giving them life-giving moisture. It always made him feel joyful. And although he hadn't done this in years, Dan felt the same sense of happiness he had felt back at the orphanage. Suddenly, he heard a female voice. "Hello, who might you be?" The young man smiled and shrugged. "I'm a friend of Gina's. My name is Dan. And I'm Darlene. Nice to meet you. Forgive me for the impertinent question, are you just a friend to Gina?" "Just a friend," Dan confirmed, thinking to himself, what does she need to know? What's the difference, friend or not? Although, older people are generally quite curious. "Dan, I apologize. It's just that this girl means a lot to me. I wouldn't want you to hurt her." "Understood," he nodded and went inside the house. About 10 minutes later, Darlene arrived with a pie that had the most mouth-watering aroma. Dan would have loved to have a meal, but he hadn't had time to prepare anything. "Danny, I baked a pie, but there's too much of it. Would you like some?" "I wouldn't refuse." "Tea?" As they enjoyed tea and pie, the talkative woman shared Gina's life story with him. It turned out that Gina had been married, but her husband had left her. Well, that's life. Dan couldn't quite understand how anyone could leave such a wonderful girl. Moreover, he took to heart the fact that Gina had been pregnant and had lost the baby. The pregnancy had been well along, so she had known she might have had a son. Her ex was a real piece of work, Darlene said, shaking her head. He cheated on Gina left and right. And in the end, he left her for one of her friends, so please don't hurt her. Dan was far from intending to offend Gina. So he readily responded, "You don't have to worry about that, I won't offend her. And we're not a couple. Just look at it. I'm disabled, Gina is perfectly fine. I just help her, and she returns the favor. There's nothing more to it." Darlene gave Dan a sly look but said nothing. She seemed to be lost in her own thoughts. In the morning, Dan and Gina left for the city. Their new friends didn't make an appearance, and Dan wasn't eager for their company. Something told him that it was better to keep his distance from that crowd. But, as they say never. A few days later, in the evening, when Dan rolled up to his apartment, his friends were waiting for him in full force. "So, shall we go out and have some fun?" Alvin asked cheerfully. Frankly speaking, Dan was bored, and he agreed. The guys drank and talked about everything and nothing. Suddenly, the conversation turned back to the apartment. To be honest, Dan had forgotten about it. He figured it was just a drunken conversation that wasn't worth taking seriously. Besides, after Darlene's story, all Dan's thoughts were about Gina. The friends were persistent, and although Dan was a bit tipsy, he couldn't ignore the fact that there was something more to it. After all, the intuition of orphaned kids is as sharp as a good hunting dog's. He promised to think about it again, but this time, he was told, "Well, think about it, but faster." And noticing Dan's wary expression, Douglas added that the options were limited. While he was thinking, he might miss a great opportunity. It all seemed logical, but the guy felt like a veil had been lifted from his eyes. Dan realized with horror that he had gotten himself into trouble. He needed to disappear from their sight, or things could get ugly. "Gina, I need to talk to you seriously," Dan said the next day when he arrived at her place. He explained his situation with the suspicious trio, and the girl suggested that Dan move in with her. "In any case, it'll be easier this way," Gina said. "I don't know about you, but I feel like you've become like family to me. I feel lonely by myself, and my mom, I think, can't live here after Dad's death. Although she does visit me, of course." Dan felt awkward about imposing on the girl, which he told her. But Gina just laughed. "Now Mom has found an old beau. I think she'll be too busy for visits now. So, you won't be imposing on me." "Well, that's a relief," Gina thought with a sigh of relief. "Now it's for sure." Settling into the village, Dan came to love it as much as Gina did. The quiet, fresh air, and intoxicating smells of nature had a calming effect on him. "How did I not notice this before when I visited here?" the guy wondered. The people who had initially been cautious with Dan soon grew to love the charming brunette. He, in turn, came to appreciate the straightforward and unpretentious villagers. Each neighbor tried to make him feel welcome. Sandra Smith, an elderly woman who seemed strict but was actually a kind soul, brought Gina and Dan milk, homemade sour cream, cottage cheese, and cheese. Darlene, who lived nearby, invited the young couple almost every day to enjoy her homemade baked goods or delicious roasts, for which she was quite a master. Soon, another resident joined Gina in her cozy log cabin. Gina and Dan loved walking in the forest. In the summer, they picked raspberries, strawberries, and flowers, and when autumn came, they started foraging for mushrooms. Gina adored collecting oak leaves and dried plants to make wonderful autumn bouquets. On a pleasant September day, when the young couple was approaching the village, they came across another discovery. "It sounds like someone is squeaking," said Gina. "Somewhere near the garbage bins." They followed the sound and found a light-colored puppy, all covered in mud. "They probably threw him away," she guessed. "They throw away kittens and puppies." "It's a pity for the little guy, that's for sure," Dan agreed. "But the dog is beautiful. Very beautiful." The puppy turned out to be a male, and Dan suggested naming him Max. "Oh, I like it," exclaimed Gina and addressed the foundling. "Hello, Max. Want to come live with us?" The puppy trustingly snuggled against Gina's chest. It was an indescribable feeling, like having a child. They came home and fed the little one fresh milk that Sandra had brought. After drinking, the puppy fell asleep on a piece of sheepskin that Gina had found in the closet. Dan also decided to take a nap. He generally enjoyed sleeping after walks. Meanwhile, Gina started preparing dinner. Suddenly, the young woman caught herself thinking that they looked like a real family, Gina, Dan, and Max. "It's silly, of course," she thought. "But it feels so nice." Dan and Gina speculated about the puppy's breed. From his long and sturdy legs, they could tell he would grow up to be a large dog. As Max grew, Dan guessed that he might be a mix. "He looks like an alibi," he said thoughtfully. "But clearly not purebred. I can't figure out what breed he's mixed with. Maybe a German Shepherd?" "Oh, who cares?" exclaimed Gina. "The important thing is that we love him." Max grew to the size of a calf. No walk was complete without this handsome guy. The beautiful mutt thoroughly enjoyed running around the winter forest, hilariously sneezing and scrunching his nose as he swallowed the snow falling from the trees. One day, Gina was woken up by someone roughly grabbing her hair. When she fully came to, she screamed in terror. A man wearing a bandana had wrapped her hair around his hand and was holding a knife to her throat. "Where's the gold?" asked the intruder, completely dispelling any hope that Gina might be dreaming. "What gold?" she asked, her teeth chattering from fear. Her fear turned into sheer terror when a second voice answered. Don't play dumb. What gold? Your old man's gold. And a man wearing a cowboy hat approached Gina. Interesting, how did they get here? She wondered. And how did they get past Max? Oh God, what if? We don't have any gold. Dad was just a geologist, he went on expeditions. That's right, said the first man. He did stumble upon a gold vein during one of his expeditions. My dad died 7 years ago, and I haven't heard anything about a gold vein. But the robbers, judging by their skeptical snorts, were clearly not satisfied with that answer. Fatso! Shouted the man in the bandana. Is everything clear? From the room where Dan was sleeping, a third voice was heard. It's some guy. What should we do with him? Gina panicked again. How many of them are there? Dan is completely defenseless. And I'm not exactly a fighter. There was snorting and some rustling from the direction of the window. Before Gina could get scared, Max appeared in the bedroom. He approached the robbers, growling menacingly as he started advancing on them. Good doggy, said the cowboy hat man, trying to sound ingratiating. Pretty boy. But Max did not accept such crude flattery and barked a warning. Maybe we should deal with the dog? Suggested the voice from the kitchen. Apparently, that was the fatso who had entered Dan's room. Are you an idiot or something? The man in the bandana shouted. Let's get out of here. He's going to raise the whole neighborhood. The robbers attempted to escape through the window, but it was no use. It turned out that the neighbors had already gathered at the noise, and the arrival of a police car completely eliminated any chance for the robbers to flee. Hands on the hood! Shouted one of the officers. The police questioned the occupants of the house and, after offering a few words of praise to Max, drove off. Gina was still trembling with fear. I'm shaking, she said, shivering. I can't wrap my head around this, some kind of gold. Is that even possible? Dan asked. Who knows? Dad was a geologist and could have found anything. But to hide something somewhere in the house? It's absurd. Maybe some tea? I won't be able to sleep anyway. What time is it, by the way? 4 o'clock. You've got to be kidding. It's almost time to get up. After drinking some tea, Gina went to bed and began to ponder. Could there be any truth to what the intruders had said? Unable to think of anything, she eventually fell asleep. Soon, Gina got an answer to her question. A few days later, she received a summons to the police station. That's when Gina realized that the robbers were none other than her father's former colleagues, Timothy Jackson, Sean Nelson, and Peter Evans. Have you heard of them? Asked Detective Raymond Chandler. No, never, she replied. Dad never mentioned the names of his colleagues. Well, who knows, he might have been friends with someone who came to your house. No, nothing like that. I see. Let's clarify. Edward Hunt is your father? Yes, that's correct. He died 7 years ago during one of his expeditions. Did you know that your father wasn't just an ordinary geologist? The detective looked at Gina so intently that she felt as though he suspected her of something. Although, what could she be afraid of? Gina really didn't know anything. I wonder if Mom knew about this, she thought, and asked the detective. What do you mean, not just an ordinary? The answer left Gina open-mouthed in astonishment. It turned out that Edward worked for a private company that was only interested in gold. He was searching for deposits for private gold mines. To say the least, her father was indeed quite an unusual geologist. But that was just the beginning. 7 years ago, Edward and his colleagues stumbled upon a genuine gold vein. Guys, it looks like we've found something valuable, exclaimed Sean. Really? Oh my gosh. Edward widened his eyes. Yes, these are nuggets. I've never seen so many, even in my dreams. The four men stood by the gold deposit. The yellow metallic gleam tickled not only their eyes, but also their nerves. Each of them imagined a new car, of course, a foreign model. One saw himself in a new house, far from his hated mother-in-law. Another thought he could finally get some new teeth and pay off his substantial debts. And the fourth, namely Edward, was determined to give his only daughter a lavish wedding. Each had their own dreams, but they all shared one unsettling thought. With so much wealth, anyone would go crazy, Raymond said with a smirk. Nuggets. One after another. It's like the treasures of Ali Baba. Anyone would lose their mind. The geologists collected the gold and stored it in a cabin that served as their hideout. But soon after, Edward died in a river crossing. The accomplices, who had actually been to Gina's house, went to search Edward's hideout. But there was no gold to be found. It was perfectly logical that Edward had moved it, that is, taken it home. If, indeed, he took it home. But there were no other options. They didn't give up hope of finding a new gold vein, the detective continued. But 7 years of searching proved fruitless. So they decided to try their luck at my house, and if they were lucky, take Dad's gold? Gina suggested. Exactly, Raymond nodded. Later, they realized that your father had probably told you nothing. Either he didn't have the chance or simply didn't want to, hoping to turn the gold into money and delight his dear family. Gina didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After losing the head of their family, she and her mother weren't destitute, but they didn't live extravagantly either. They had everything necessary for a normal life, and they never dreamed of wealth. But what if there really is gold in the house? The girl thought, clutching her head. Oh God, if it's true, Gina could help Dan with his surgery. That was the most important thing for her. Calm down, she told herself. Why dream in vain? The more hope, the greater the disappointment. It's like something out of a detective story, she said. There are even stranger cases in real life, the detective remarked philosophically. And tell me, if the gold does exist, is it possible to find it? Maybe with a dog or some other way. Nothing could be simpler. Raymond smiled. You use a metal detector for that. In the end, the gold was indeed found in the house. The metal detector responded to the kitchen wall. Well, congratulations, said Raymond. I hope you remember that, according to the law, a large portion of it belongs to the state. Yes, of course, Gina replied. Her heart was singing. Even with the portion of the found gold that goes to the state, they would still have a substantial amount of money on hand. Whether anything would be left didn't concern her too much. Let them earn. Gina has a job, and God willing, Dan will start earning too. The young couple sat on the terrace, armed with a tablet. Max was trotting around them. Good boy. Gina smiled, reaching out to her pet. The dog stretched toward his owner, closing his eyes contentedly. So big and brave. He reminds me of a big baby. That's true, Dan smiled. After getting his favorite peanuts, Max settled down beside them, and Dan and Gina continued their task. Finally, after reviewing a dozen offers, they settled on a prestigious German clinic. The reviews seemed convincing, and 2 weeks later, the young couple flew to Munich. They were seen off by the whole neighborhood. May God protect you on your journey, said Darlene, wiping away tears. And of course, Dan, I wish you a speedy recovery. I'll take care of Max. Take good care of him, Gina smiled, her eyes also suspiciously moist. He's our guardian. Don't even worry about that. Oh, I can't believe you girls, exclaimed Monica Sullivan. Such joy, and you're all making it so damp. These are tears of joy, Gina said. I will pray for Dan's health, said Jeanette, who had also come to see them off along with Dennis. The man shook Dan's hand and said, Hang in there, buddy. We're all with you. Before the taxi arrived for Gina and Dan, each of the well-wishers managed to say a few kind words. Everyone who lived nearby had grown fond of the amazing couple and their fearless four-legged friend. And, of course, they all sincerely hoped that Dan would start walking. To be honest, both were a little scared. What if something went wrong and Dan remained in a wheelchair? Even if that happens, Gina thought as the plane climbed, I will love Dan more than life itself. Needless to say, the emotions Dan was experiencing were intense. However, all their fears turned out to be unfounded. On the day of the operation, Gina felt like everything was falling apart. It feels like they're going to operate on you. Dan laughed. Before the surgery, he needed to undergo a full examination, and Gina accompanied him to every room. The German doctors looked at them with affection. And then, the operation was successful, said the young translator with a smile after the small, chubby, and very funny little person in a surgical suit said something. There's still rehabilitation ahead, but the worst is over. Soon your husband will be able not only to walk, but also to dance. He's not my husband, Gina smiled through her tears. I hope, not yet. The translator said something to the doctor, who replied in Russian. I wish you happiness. Take care of Dan. Gina rushed to hug the little person who, according to patient reviews, had helped many disabled people get back on their feet. Danke, she said with feeling. Victor Seiler patted Gina on the shoulder and went back to his office. It's so wonderful here, Dan said. I wouldn't want to leave. They sat on a bench in the clinic's courtyard, which resembled a luxurious hotel. Roses of various kinds and the most incredible colors grew in the garden. Lilies, thujas, and other amazing plants whose names they didn't know. There was also a small decorative pond with a fountain. Listening to the cheerful burbling, they wanted to think only of good things. Gina felt as if they were in paradise, not in the courtyard of a Munich clinic. And home? She teased Dan. Well, of course. But I'd stay here for. I can see where this is going. Gina laughed. Gina? Yes? Will you marry me? The girl looked at Dan in astonishment. Marry you? Yes. Sorry for the lack of a ring. And of course, I still need to get back on my feet, but I swear, you won't regret it. I promise to be a good husband. Gina had often wondered how Dan felt about her. She had already understood everything about herself. Gina had fallen in love with Dan the day she rescued him from the competing beggars. What she had initially thought was sympathy and a desire to help turned out to be love. And Dan. Sorry, I didn't start this the right way, he continued. Gina, I've loved you for a long time. I fell in love with you back when you desperately rushed to save me. Remember? She nodded with a smile. So? What's your answer? Yes. Well, of course, yes. Returning to their home country as a bride and groom, Gina and Dan spent the entire trip planning their life together. They decided to live in the village, renovate their house, have at least 3 children, and buy a minivan for family picnics. The young couple went straight from the airport to get married. As they left, a staff member thought, it's clear these two are marrying out of true love. Gina, remember how you suggested we go to a cafe back at the bus station? Dan suddenly asked. Yes, I remember, Gina shrugged. And what? Gina, I realized everything right away. Let's not dwell on the negative. He smiled. I'm thinking positively now. I want to invite you to a cafe. Let's celebrate, so to speak, the submission of our application. Aren't you tired? Gina asked with concern. You've only recently started walking, and now you're putting so much strain on your legs. You should listen to me, after all, I'm a doctor. Dan walked with a cane and looked good overall. But Gina knew that such euphoria from newfound mobility could potentially backfire on him. Oh, come on. Dan waved off. Just this once. And I solemnly swear to stick to bed rest until the wedding. Watch it. Gina playfully warned him. I'm holding you to that. The soon-to-be-married couple went into the nearest cafe, bought a bunch of different foods and a bottle of champagne, and celebrated the submission of their application. Exhaustion took its toll, and the bride and groom called a taxi to the cafe and headed to the village. Seeing the car, Darlene threw up her hands. "Max, they're back." "Well, what? Home?" The dog joyfully whined and wagged his tail. He already understood that his beloved owners had returned. As soon as Dan and Gina paid the driver and got out of the car, Max broke free from the neighbor's arms and began to enthusiastically lick his owners one by one. "Max!" Gina exclaimed. "My boy, I've missed you so much." "Good boy," Dan said, ruffling the dog's neck. After thanking the kind neighbor and promising to visit later, the young couple went inside their house. They spent time with their beloved pet, fed him various treats, and then all three took a nap together. Jeanette woke up at dawn with the feeling that something good was bound to happen today. Singing to herself, she prepared a sumptuous breakfast and set the table. "Wow!" Dennis exclaimed, waking up to the delicious aromas. "What's the occasion for such a feast, and so early?" The kids submitted their application. The woman smiled happily. "They went straight from the airport to get married, can you believe it? That's efficient, I must say. Youth. Well, what are we waiting for?" Dennis had often talked about formalizing their relationship. Jeanette appreciated his attitude but didn't attach much importance to the formality herself. Dennis and Jeanette didn't have and didn't foresee having any children together, and each had their own living space. They lived in Dennis's apartment and rented out Jeanette's place. She was content with her longtime admirer. Sometimes Jeanette felt that she loved him. Although maybe she did love him. Edward was long gone, and she wasn't old yet. So why not be happy? Not as a person or a mother, but as a woman. "Dennis, I promise we'll definitely come back to this conversation," Jeanette said. "But let me enjoy my daughter's happiness for now, okay?" "As you wish. And tomorrow, we're invited to the engagement party." "That's great." In the evening, the future spouses were watching TV. When the news started showing crime reports, Dan suddenly said, "Turn it up." "What's the matter?" Gina asked, concerned. "Those faces look familiar," Dan murmured. "And the house." The news was showing someone being carried out of Dan's house in a black bag. Dan might not have recognized who from his former neighbors had passed away if it hadn't been for the sight of the two suspects being arrested, Ted and Douglas. After hearing the report, Dan was sure his guess was correct, and Alvin had been pointing out vulnerable people to them: alcoholics, drug addicts, disabled individuals, lonely elderly people, and others who had fallen through the cracks of society or were on the brink of it. As it turned out, Alvin was the victim of Ted and Douglas. Although it wasn't hard to guess. I wonder what he did to piss them off, Dan thought. Or did he refuse to cooperate? Does it even matter? The main thing is that God spared me from them, and it turned out to be just in time. Is it them? Gina asked. Dan nodded and resolutely changed the channel. I don't want to hear anything about them. I have a new life now. Gina squeezed his hand encouragingly and mentally vowed, I'll do everything to make Dan forget what happened to him after the accident. For the engagement party, besides Jeanette and Dennis, they invited a few neighbors and a couple of Gina's work friends, nurse Karen Butler and orthopedic specialist Barbara Maldonado. The girls looked at the groom with approval, each thinking, finally, Gina found happiness. Of all people, she deserves it. They knew well how Gina's first marriage ended and sincerely hoped that this charming dark-haired guy would bring her a different outcome. The weather was gorgeous, so they set up the tables outside. Tables and chairs were gathered by everyone together. Additionally, guests brought pickles, jams, pies, and other goodies. Dan was reminded of old village movies and smiled. But, actually, he really liked it. Everything looked very warm and family-like. As someone who had never really had a family or known domestic comfort, he couldn't help but appreciate it. Max was bouncing around nearby, but no one even thought of being afraid of him. Everyone knew that this big guy was friendly, and he was merciless only to those who came with bad intentions, like those three. The dog was in a good mood. With his canine instincts, he sensed that now his owners would always be together. Wedding preparations were in full swing, and the bride and groom were planning a grand celebration. They had already decided that the wedding would take place in the village. How could it be otherwise? How wonderful it is, Dan said when Gina came into the kitchen to check on the cabbage pie. The groom was sitting in a woven chair, happily stretching his legs and wiggling his toes. It was incredible. Just recently, he couldn't do that. Good, agreed the bride. But would you like it even better? What will you surprise me with? He asked curiously. Gina ran into the room and came back holding something in her hands. What's that? Guess. Which hand is it in? She asked with a sly smile. When Dan guessed correctly on the first try, he saw a small piece of paper with 2 red stripes. Gina, what about the pie? Jeanette asked. Her eyes fell on the paper. Pregnant? Jeanette's eyes sparkled with mischievous excitement. Well, you can see for yourself. Gina, are you serious? Dan exclaimed. It's the absolute truth. We're going to the altar as a trio. Quartet. You forgot about Max. Dan and Gina's wedding day turned out to be clear and sunny. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and freshly mowed grass. There were no matchmakers, ransom rituals, or other traditional wedding trappings. Or were there any mandatory traditions? It wasn't about the fact that the bride and groom had been living together for a year and were expecting their first child. It was just that in that year, they had experienced more together than most long-married couples. But the most important thing was that Dan and Gina had healed each other's wounded souls and hearts and restored each other's zest for life. As planned, the wedding was celebrated in the village. But first, as is customary, there was the registration. The groom could now move around freely without a cane. In fact, he was recovering not by the day but by the hour. No matter what you say, Victor Seiler is a real magician, they would say. And now, thanks to this person, comically looking but with golden hands, Dan would be able to dance the wedding waltz with his bride. In a dark gray wedding suit with a pink boutonniere, the groom looked incredibly dashing. Gina also looked stunning. She deliberately chose not to buy a fluffy white dress with ruffles and rhinestones, as it reminded her too much of her ridiculous first marriage. The satin cream dress with a high waist and thin straps elegantly highlighted her figure while discreetly hiding her interesting condition. Gina had styled her luxurious chestnut hair into an elaborate updo and adorned it with fresh white flowers. You look so beautiful, Dan said tenderly. Like a fairy tale princess. You look great too, the bride-to-be replied playfully. Hearing the car pull up to the house, she announced grandly, and here's our carriage. For their special day, the couple had ordered a limousine. If they were going to celebrate, they were going all out. They invited everyone who attended the engagement party, as well as a few friends from Dan's orphanage. Well done, Dan, Lewis said approvingly. You snagged yourself a real beauty. I know, the groom responded with satisfaction, then added seriously, but my Gina isn't just a beauty. She's my guardian angel. You wouldn't believe where she pulled me from. It's probably better not to know. This couple's love story has been hard-earned, the MC said pointedly a few hours later, as the newlyweds and guests sat at long tables in the backyard. The young, elegant host spoke about how their love was genuine because it had weathered many trials. The guests listened to him, each reflecting on their own thoughts. Dan's friends from the orphanage remembered the reckless heartthrob Dan used to be before the accident and noted how he had changed. His eyes were different now. They were no longer those of a carefree guy, a ladies' man, but of a man who had endured serious hardships. Gina's friends admired the remarkable young woman who had faced many challenges. Neighbor Darlene recalled the wheelchair-bound man watering cucumbers a year ago, to whom she had shared Gina's story. He truly didn't do her wrong. The elderly woman thought. It would be a shame if things didn't work out for them, they make such a great couple. Dennis reflected on how, thanks to Jeanette, he had met these wonderful young people. Their love story had moved him deeply. Finally, my girl is happy. Jeanette thought. I just hope Dan and Gina carry this love through to the end. She remembered her first son-in-law, who had long made Gina lose faith in love and trust in men. For years, Gina had kept her heart closed, until a beggar at the train station managed to ignite the flame of love within her. But no matter what anyone thought, everyone undoubtedly wished them happiness and a strong, sincere love. Dan gazed adoringly at his young wife and pondered what his life would have been like without meeting Gina. Definitely nothing good, the newlywed concluded. Gina suddenly thought of her father. Dad was always caring and generous to his girls. How he referred to his wife and daughter. But Edward could never have guessed the royal gift Gina would give him 7 years after his death. Not only to Gina, but to her husband as well, even if he had committed such an unseemly act. The young woman looked up at the blue July sky. Who knows, maybe Edward was watching his daughter and rejoicing, how much happiness the gold hidden in the kitchen wall had brought her. Bitter. Someone shouted. At that moment, their hearts beat in unison. And not just their hearts, but their thoughts as well. I love you. They both said simultaneously and laughed. May you always have such harmony throughout your married life. Jeanette said with feeling. Wishing you all the happiness, my dear children. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.